But I feel okay. She just told me it's being recorded. But what we're saying, like, I feel like this feels like an epiphany, or it
Well,
feels like
if this is being
it
recorded,
feels like an apocalypse.
okay. Well,
I just started recording, but maybe something good will happen still.
yeah.
The example that's coming to mind is, so we have a healthcare system that's based on science and sort of the rational procedure, rational scientific procedures and stuff. And there's stories out there of, let's say, a mother who brings their kid in and says, like, something's wrong. I know something's wrong with my kid, and they do all the tests, and they either misdiagnose or they can't figure it out. They're just like, oh, there's nothing wrong or whatever. And the mother basically has to be almost on the verge of kind of like hysterical, she has to constantly be bothering the doctors and the professionals in the system, because they're locked into this mode. They're like, when I look at the charts, I don't see anything. When I look at the tests we've done, I can't figure it out. When I look at this, I see this. And the mother's like, you're wrong. That's not right. Yeah. And she's only going on her intuition. So she doesn't have any science to back it up, but she knows that they're wrong and she needs help for her child. These stories aren't rare. They're fairly common, and the mother will say, I felt like I was crazy because and then finally there would be a doctor that would listen to her, and so this is the doctor who has faith, let's say, rather than the doctor that is reasonable, the doctor who has faith like finally listens and then is like, all right, let's figure this out then, and then they figure out what the issue was or whatever, hopefully. But that's the interruption into the system. If you just following the system, if you're just following the rational procedures, if you're just following that, you have to block out the subjective, because if you listen to every hysterical person that came into your practice and demanded that they actually have, like, you don't get any of your science and any of your stuff right. And so it's only
and that's models. Yeah, models, and all models are false. Some are useful. You have to exclude the anomaly and the weirdness and the noise, or else you can't actually see the data or the information or what's really there. You exclude the noise, but what if the noise? What if the anomaly? What if the subjective apocalypse into the normative is? What if it is real?
Yep.
And you've made like a totalizing system out of the model.
Yep.
Right. So I just want to, in case we end up doing anything with this, I would love Jess and Jeff. God, you made a brilliant point too that you got to bring back up, but I want to give context of where this was all coming from. So we were initially talking about.
Yeah. Well,
we were initially talking about.
Luke, hang on just a second, because. Yeah, I'm thinking the exact same thing that you are, Luke. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say that
go.
What we've said so far since we started recording just reminds me of how sometimes podcasts start or videos start with like a clip from the conversation, and then there's like context that's brought in, or the beginning of the conversation starts. So it's almost like that was a little intro taste, and now we can back up and kind of go. And bring everybody up to speed with what we're talking about.
Right.
So go ahead.
We'll cut in the music and the little animation.
Yeah. All right. We'll let you do that, Jess, since you're the expert at that.
Yeah. Well, so I was just going to say, like, I was going to recap quick. So what had happened is we were talking with Jeff, who's out on his Exodus 90, I'm a monk, pietist thing with Job and all these other people.
We're just better than you guys. Just
you guys
feel it. We definitely feel it.
I mean, I didn't want to just call it an elitist excursion, but we can call it that.
Well, notice I put on my glasses. You can't see this, Luke, but I'm wearing my glasses for this conversation. So
I hope they're sunglasses. So we were talking about Jeff doing, because Jeff is the administrative brilliance and artistic brilliance behind Randos United. So we were asking him how, because Julian was concerned if Jeff wouldn't be able to put out these videos and make his thumbnails and stuff. And so Jeff was filling us in on that process. And then that brought us to talking about Julian and his just prolific conversational content and his conversation with Nathan. And so then we were just talking about that a little bit, and how, I just wasn't a big fan of the spirit of the conversation. And then riffing off of that somehow, Jess, you brought in the comment that you made in promos on the Discord, which is a really well-made comment that we were talking about. But if you want to maybe just recap that and bring in that point about Job too. Yeah.
Yeah. So Nathan was talking about, he asked the question just very plainly. He's like, did God tell Abraham to sacrifice his son? And Julian's answer was a little bit, he was trying to get nuanced about it. And it was, I don't know, not to be hard on Julian, but it was like unsatisfactory, because the answer is plainly yes.
Right.
But
the comment below the video was essentially like Julian's comments were just like, it's complicated, it's nuanced.
Yeah. And so, but I think what Nathan was trying to get at was, all right, so, and he even said this, he was like, if God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, does that set a precedent where God can tell you right now to kill your mother? And how do you, and would you do it? And so the spirit of the question is like, why would you subscribe to an axiom that would ask you to possibly kill your mother? And behind that is like, and sort of this, like, God may not be real. It may just be a delusion in your head. And then you're listening to delusions in your head. And how do you figure that, all this stuff is kind of underneath that. Anyway, the thing is that it doesn't get you out of the problem of something foundational asking you to kill your mother.
Let me just jump in for 1 second and interrupt you real quick, Jess. Yeah. I think my understanding of the crux of the question from, I think it's a question that I have sometimes too, in different arenas, but it's just, why would you listen to a person telling you to kill your mother? I think that's the heart of it. Right. I think there's a deep morality underneath that question that needs to be honored, right?
Yeah.
Why would I listen to a person that tells me to kill someone that I love? So I wanted to bring forth the emotional and the moral force of that.
Yeah, and Nathan's just trying to ask like a very plain question with a common sense answer, and then the idea that you would try to get nuanced about it is almost like playing into the idea that like this God stuff is a little bit too ridiculous, because
and it really has the feel of trying to be slippery, and it's the God of the gaps where you just say nuance.
And just one last thing, to be fair, Julian is not trying to be slippery, and he's not trying to be bad faith or deceitful. Julian is very honest in trying to answer that question.
Yeah.
Yes, so, I think Julian, because whatever, Julian will watch this and tell us what he thinks. But I think what we're getting at and what Jess and Jeff are articulating that we're trying to recap, I think is what Julian would say. He just didn't know how to say it. So he said nuance.
So my thing is like God's the axiom, right? And whatever the axiom says, like you do. But and Nathan's like, why would you listen to the axiom if it says kill your mother? But we do that with it doesn't get you out of the problem if you get rid of God, because you could be a rationalist, and if it's the rational thing to do to kill your mother, you kill your mother. Or you could be a humanist, and if you're like, it's the humanist thing to do to kill your mother, you kill your mother. Or it could be about well-being, or whatever you want to substitute in there.
We brought up euthanasia or Hitler.
Euthanasia is like
go back in time.
Euthanasia is the perfect one, where if your mother is sick and she's in pain, you like, to be very blunt, you kill your mother. And it's the humanistic, it's got a humanistic axiom to it, or
well-being.
And so the question can be posed to any axiom that could possibly ask you to kill your mother. It doesn't get you out of any, like, this isn't unique to God or anything.
Yeah, and I had brought up that it's essentially the Jordan Peterson idea that or it's a Jonathan Edwards, Cal and I talk about this a lot, that whatever your chief value is, whatever you value the most, you cannot not act in accordance with. And so whether or not that is this ineffable God that I don't understand, and it's a person versus axiom who told me to do something, if that is my highest value, I will obey it. If your highest value is your reason and what you can rationally comprehend in an articulable way, like my mom is suffering, I don't want her to suffer, mitigating suffering is the most loving, merciful thing to do, you'll kill your mother.
Yeah, or the other example,
act in accordance with that.
Yeah, the other example I brought up was, what if your mother is an absolutely terrible person and she's making everyone's life a living hell, and it is in the rational interest of everyone's well-being in the community if you killed your mother.
Right. That was the motivation of Raskolnikov, by the way.
Exactly.
I've completely going brain dead on the title of the book.
in Crime and Punishment?
Crime and Punishment, and Dostoevsky, yeah.
And Jeff, you brought up the point about your
my cat.
Your cat.
Yeah, I mean, our cat that we dearly loved was suffering, right? And it's not the same as a person. I grant this. I don't. But one of the people I admire greatly talked about in his writings that our pets almost become human. We confer. We talk to them. We talk to them like we talk to kids sometimes, like infants, right? Infants eventually start picking it up and become what we are. But you draw your pets up into your own humanity, and in the end, they almost become that. And so that love is very similar. It's it's of the same flavor, at least. And reason and the suffering that the cat was going through, and she had stopped eating and wasn't drinking anymore. She was in the late stages of kidney failure, and we had to make a tough decision, but that decision was grounded in, do we want this cat to suffer more just so we can have her presence and be with her longer? It's still a difficult question for me to ponder, but we ultimately landed there, and that's where a lot of people land. Most people don't just let their pets die in suffering and starve themselves to death at home. They go to the vet, they go to the animal hospital, and they do the hard thing. And that's based on an axiom or some axioms stacked together. And so I'm following those when I do that, and I still question whether or not I was following the right axiom.
Right.
I wanted the cat's health to turn around and miraculously change, and then what did I want? Asking myself questions: do I just want this cat to live forever? What was I expecting? Nature. I think Paul said this once, or he got it from somebody else. My God kills kittens and grandmothers, and sure enough, the time and entropy is going to kill our pets, and eventually it's going to kill us. It kills our parents, it kills our grandparents, it's going to kill us. So this is what we're really talking about.
So
hey Jess, can you talk about don't forget about talking about the subjective and the rationalist imposing kind of anachronistic.
Go back to the Isaac and the Abraham.
So I think the axiom, the way we're viewing the axiom of God in the story of Abraham is from our own modern viewpoint. And I want to contrast this with the idea that Abraham had faith. He didn't have a rationalization in his belief. He had a faith. And I don't know if those are necessarily the right words to use, but I'll use them for now. Because I think, this is a little snarky, that I think if Abraham had rationally ascended to the conclusion that God wanted him to kill Isaac, he wouldn't have let anything interrupt him, because that would have been a subjective thing. So when he raised the knife, because he had faith, there was something able to interrupt him. God could interrupt him in that moment because he had. That's different than if he had a rational. What am I trying? reason scheme that in that moment when he raises the knife, he's not going to let his subjective experience stop him from carrying out what he believes that he should be doing. So he would,
the system of rationality will have been set in, whereas you were talking about the anomaly of the subjective in that moment broke through and he listened to it, whereas it would have been much harder if he had set his reason, if he had set his mind to something. I mean, that's what that means.
Yep.
And so you had brought up oh shoot, I just lost it.
So, well, just as God told him to kill Isaac, God was also the one that interrupted the process. And so there's a mode at play there that's different than some sort of a rationally deduced, action. It was a faith in something because Abraham didn't even believe it himself in a rational way, because the way it said that maybe he will be resurrected, maybe this other stuff will happen. There's got to be some other way out of this, because this can't be the end. And so Abraham was trying to, he didn't allow his own rationalizations of it get in the way of his faith. And so, and that goes right into my example that I said at the beginning about the mother going to the doctors, because
killing your mother. Yeah.
Well, no, the mother with the child. Like, so,
the mother has
a sick child.
One
Go
thing
ahead.
I want to add in quick. I just want to add in a quick thing with the Isaac story is, because I think a lot of times people read that story and you imagine that God, and I mean, correct me if you guys remember the text better than me, but I think a lot of times people imagine that God broke in some kind of anomalous, miraculous way, like the clouds opened and God descended in some manifested form of, the pre-incarnate Christ, Jesus, Logos, whatever, because God the Father can't be manifested. Little Trinitarian theology for you. But God broke in some kind of really obvious written in the sky way and said, don't do it. But we don't know that.
Yeah.
I don't think we know that from the text. I think it just essentially says God stayed his hand, which could have completely been a subjective desire
whisper
that just came up within him. Yeah.
It could have been a whisper.
Anyhow.
And he saw
absolutely.
the ram tangled in the thorns.
An internal one. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
so
I just wanted to add that.
Yes. So, there's a distinction that I think that needs to be made between a personal God and sort of a rational theistic view. And I would advocate for a personal God. That would mean something that can interrupt you. That means something that and this is a mode of faith rather than.
That's good. I think that's good as just a little. When you were just saying God, it has to be that's just a great, almost pithy definition that I could just roll with, and you could write a book on that. God is that which can interrupt you. I'm not even kidding.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I
think that's a succinct way to really say a lot of what Paul has been figuring out and saying over the last 2 years.
Because rationalism can't interrupt you.
Yes, it's a totalizing system. Gosh dang, that's good.
Well, and that brings us back to the mother with the sick child. The mother knows there's something wrong. She doesn't have the scientific expertise to figure it out. So she goes to the experts, and the experts run the tests, and they do all the things, and they run the child through all the systems, and they can't figure it out. And so the mother has to find, she's the one with faith. So she's the one, and she's the one that has to interrupt the system in a way. And so she, in a way, has to become hysterical or unreasonable, because she'll have to go and she'll have to call 15 times, and she'll have to be a bothersome, or she'll have to bother the doctors, and they're going to get tired of her.
I don't care what your tests say. I know something's wrong.
And it's not like the doctors are at fault, because they can't let every person that interrupts their stuff have their way. And so
that's the way it's designed. All models are false, some are useful. Like your models ultimately, what that means, what that saying means, that I love to quote all the time, the statistician George Bach, is that you can't totalize models. That's what he means. all models are ultimately false if you totalize them and press them to the nth degree and make every anomaly part like interpreted within the system, within the model. You can't do that. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, and I think this even makes the point that like rationalism's not evil. Rationalism is good,
Right.
but it has to have the possibility of being interrupted by the person.
Yes.
And you know, and this is a double-edged thing, and it's not really easy because Nathan's question still has like some bite to it, because God interrupted the rational when he told Abraham to kill his son, but he also interrupted the rational process, interrupting it and stopping it. And so I don't know if we've got to a conclusive answer, but I do like the distinction between having faith and then sort of a rational theism where you've ascended to, you know, whatever beliefs or actions that you could take.
Well,
because it's still hard. I mean, you're left with the book of Job no matter what, because God didn't stay his hand when he murdered all the babies in the flood, as Nathan likes to bring up too, you know.
And he didn't.
You're still left with trouble.
He didn't stay the hand of, you know, the various Israelite generals or kings when he ordered them, you know, to go slaughter the outside communities.
Smash the babies' heads on the stones.
Well, and there's something really interesting in the book of Job, and I haven't brought it up yet. But when, so like God tells Satan he can take away everything from Job. And so there's like raiders from one side that take and steal from this part of his stuff. And then there's raiders that come in from the other side. Then there's like a fire from heaven. And then the way his kids die are they're having a birthday celebration of the oldest son in his house. And and a wind comes and strikes the four corners of the house. So it's almost like the idea of a tornado or something.
Right. And also wind in Hebrew
is
spirit.
Yeah. But God comes later in a storm to speak to Job. And there's a connection, but I haven't read any of this, but in my own mind, I'm like, there's a connection between the storm that Job hears God speak from, and the whirlwind that killed his kids.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's something like you can there's there's this movie I like called Spy Game. It's Robert Redford and Brad Pitt, and there's a line where the basic premise of the movie is Brad Pitt's in prison for doing something that he shouldn't have been doing. He's in a prison in China. They were CIA operatives, and Robert Redford's character trained Brad Pitt in the CIA, and so he has a connection with him. But Brad Pitt, quote unquote, went off the reservation, and so the CIA is trying to disavow him and figure out a way that they don't have to take responsibility for this. And Robert Redford's in Washington, D.C. in the offices having meetings, trying to figure out a way he can figure out what's going on and if he can help, if anything. But so there's one point in the story where there's this one CIA guy, and he's not a good guy, but he plays everything by the book, and he knows that Robert Redford's character is trying to finagle something or not being totally forthright about what he knows about the situation. And so he's coming to him, and Robert Redford rightly figures out that basically he's looking for a reason to disavow Brad Pitt and allow him to die in a Chinese prison. And instead of like just calling it out, he tells his story. He's like, he says, "Did I tell you about my uncle who had a horse?" And he's like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, my uncle had a horse and it came up lame. So he called the vet, and the vet said, 'Well, there's nothing I can do. Do you want me to put it down for you?'" and and the uncle said something like why would I ask you to oh gosh, I'm jacking up the line. I have to look. He's like, why would I ask you to put down the horse when it's my responsibility, or something like that. And I kind of jacked up the story. I'll have to look it up. But the thing is that the uncle was trying to take responsibility for the horse, and was like, why would I ask you to put it down? Like that's my job. I'll put the horse down. And it's almost the same sort of thing in the book of Job when this windstorm comes. It's like God gave Satan the power to do that, but he's like, Satan could have done it, and maybe he was on his way to do it, but God was like, no, I'm going to take care of this. This is my responsibility. And even you could imagine that like Satan would have devised something even more terrible where an army comes and takes them away as prisoners and slaves, and rapes the daughters and humiliates the sons, and but instead God just like, no, I'm just gonna take care of this. This is my responsibility. I'm not gonna pawn this off on anyone else. Yeah. And the storm takes out the kids. I forget how we got into that.
No, I think that's really good. And I was thinking this before you went on that brilliant little riff, or not even brilliant, I would say meaningful and touching riff, and I'm just gonna, I'm gonna bring in my Tim Keller conservative evangelical kind of gospel pitch, because that's what's coming to mind right here. Because I wrote, I think in the comments under Nathan and Julian's video, that God, I think in response to maybe the babies in the flood, and I said, and this is a conviction of mine. I mean, it's a conviction of mine as a universalist, not to distract people with that, but God, I think ultimately God does take responsibility for everything, but he's not culpable. Like, that's the difference. He's not to blame, but he does take responsibility for everything. And what I would say is, like, that's most clearly seen, Sunday school answer, here it comes, in the cross. That's what he's doing. That's what he's saying, is that all this is bad, all this has gone wrong. It's not my fault, but I'm fixing it, and I'm owning it, and I'm taking responsibility for it, and I will do it, and I will do what needs to be done to fix this problem, although I didn't create the problem, but it is, and I think that's the key. It is his responsibility, and I think that's a right. I actually do think that is a right, not even critique, but it's a right intuition and judgment that a lot of atheists have. The buck does stop at God. It is his responsibility.
Yep.
It is. And how these things play out do affect the goodness of God. And you can't just say God is good, because that's what that is. That's a punt to mystery. God is good, even though we can't understand it, and it looks terrible, and it looks like God is a monster, but we're just calling that good. That's bullshit.
Yep.
And I'm not comfortable with it either. So
I mean, there's something about, like, when God says that every knee will bow and every tongue confess, he's saying that in the end, I'm going to justify everything that happened. He's not going to leave anything. He's not going to sweep anything under the rug. Everything's going to be out in the light.
And not to some abstracted law that God himself is subject to himself, to perfection, to goodness. Everything will be unified in the fullness of the perfection and love of God, because ultimately everything in God is one: mercy, justice, grace, truth, goodness, beauty. It's all the same thing, because it's all perfection.
Yeah.
And God is all of those things at the same time.
And you know, with the comment about like, why would God drown babies? And I just like, there's something about that where like in this idea that God will justify everything, God's got to justify it to each individual baby that he drowned. Basically, I don't get to be angry on any person's behalf. I have to ask God to justify myself and the things he allowed happen to me. So you know, I think of in Narnia when Aslan takes, was it Edward, aside, and they can't hear what he's saying to him, and they're like, what did you say to him? And he's like, it's none of your business. You know, basically he's like,
yeah,
what I said
yeah.
between him and me is between him and me, and we sorted it out. And that's what God promises to do with every individual person. And so the idea that I can be angry because God unjustly treated somebody, you know, even if they've said it, like they're like, God has unjustly treated me, I don't get to be angry on their behalf and justify my own, you know, to use that to justify my own unbelief or my own resentment towards God, or my own whatever anger towards being, whatever it is. Like, you have to, you know, when I'm picturing it, I'm like, do I trust that God will do that? And I do. And so then if God's going to handle each one of those cases and justify himself to each individual, then what I really need to do is get to what's in my own heart and what's bothering me about how God treated me. And, you know, in like a Job-like way, and just cry out and be like, Sherry brings this up, is a George MacDonald writing about Job, where he talks about how the created has a reasonable expectation on its creator to say, why did you do this to me, and for what reasons? And, you know, that, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say one other thing, and then I wanted to see what Jeff's thinking, the silent third party here.
Sorry, I'm talking
I know he's got, no, listen, it's been brilliant. It's been really great. And I don't know, I hear you being emotional and I can't see you, but I love it. And I'm thinking in my head, I'm just like, oh, dang, I just love you guys. This is fantastic. So what I was thinking though, and even in that George MacDonald quote, I think what strikes a lot of not even atheists, because I mean atheists is whatever. It's such an equivocation because it's how you self-identify, and I think a lot of that's a joke, you know, because it's the act as if thing. I think a lot of atheists believe in God way more so than many self-professing theists. So,
yeah.
But I think the problem is that they want. This is why at the top of the hierarchy is a person versus reason versus a law versus word. This is actually why the church is above the scripture, because the scripture isn't even lived until it's manifested by people. People are above abstracted rules, laws, reasons. They have to be, and it's why at the top of the hierarchy of all creation is a person who is Jesus Christ.
Yep.
And that's very important because it's dynamic. The kind of ossification and totalizing and authoritarian thing that can happen only can ever happen through putting reason or law or rules. This is what a lot of the New Testament is about, I think, in grace versus law, or and right. So it's very, very important that a person is at the top of the hierarchy, and not just a veiled version of your reasoned, articulated thoughts about the person himself, which transcends your ability to reduce it. It's irreducible. It's ineffable.
Yep.
And it's very important that that's the top of the hierarchy, because that's what all this stuff means. Because it gets at the Abraham Isaac stuff. It gets at the, babies dying in the flood. It gets at that's what the book of Job is about, as I would argue. It's just like, that's what God is saying at the end. It's just, who are you? Who are you? Where, in another way, it could almost be Peugeot talking to Rationality Rules. Where are you standing? I mean, that could have just as easily been what God was saying to Job. Who are you? Where are you standing that you judge me? You can't. Well, God, you can't judge me. Not that God isn't beholden to his own goodness. He is, because all those things are one in God. So that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's just that ultimately, at the end of the day, God is not subject to some law or our reason and our ability to understand it that transcends him. The top of all creation is a being.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I don't know if that even made sense, but
no, that was right. I want Jeff to chime in.
I have a few thoughts that have been running around based on what both of you were saying. I guess the first one that I'll touch on, I think I can tie all of this stuff together. At least I'll try. I'm going to do my high wire act right now and see if I can land my flip. So the drowning babies part, I think about this a lot. And when you take on an atheist perspective, you remove a person from all of the things that happen in reality. So if you have a person involved, there's an intent. There's some kind of intent behind it. There's some kind of meaning. One of the reasons that drowning babies or any of the other horrible examples that you can bring up, just from scripture, are so unpalatable, to put it mildly, to our morals, is how could a person allow things like that to happen, right? Versus,
no, that's really good, Jeff. That's true. Yeah, if there's no person, who cares?
yeah. Versus if I have an atheistic worldview, it just seems like there's something more palatable about that. There's something more palatable about, okay, at least there's not some person that is allowing these things to happen. Where if I had the ability to stop these things and it was in my hands to do it, of course I would stop it, right?
Right.
I think that's one of the honest objections. And so when I take a person out of it, I'm still left with the problem of babies being drowned by this not God anymore. Babies get drowned on a daily basis. When they there's a reason why doctors clear the amniotic fluid out of the nose and the mouth, and they smack the baby on the butt to get it to start crying, because it will suffocate. It will drown in its mother's fluid. Babies get strangled by quote unquote non-God when they have the umbilical cord wrapped around their neck. Now, can science go in and resolve these things? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The better we can get at science, maybe we can start interrupting these things. Sure. But that I want to circle back to something that I wanted to maybe challenge a little bit of what we've been talking about, where Jess, I really did like the frame that you gave of, if your axiom is reasonableness or rationality or whatever your highest ordering principle is. I think Sam Harris's well-being, a lot of humanists and atheists is human well-being. I don't think there's anything wrong with well-being, depending on how you define it. Or I think a lot of us will go a long way with saying, yeah, the well-being of people is an important thing to try to achieve. There are degrees where you can take that where it could be argued as harmful, but I'm sidetracking myself here. I think the point that I was trying to get to is, if Abraham's axiom is God, and God tells him to kill his son. I think we talked about how if you have a rationalist axiom, it could tell you the same thing too, right? The thing that I want to challenge a little bit in what we were talking about and comparing the two is rationality could have an interruption as well, right? The interruption in the Abrahamic frame is God, but also the axiom is God. So it's kind of the same thing. I could make that same argument with rationality or with well-being. Well, if I'm about to euthanize, my grandmother or my pet, rationality could also interrupt that process. It could say, well, wait a second. We have a lot of data coming in that shows that this is going to turn around, versus God staying the hand. That axiom says, no, don't do it. Well, rationality could say, oh, no, don't do this after all. There could be something that comes in and says, hey, a cure for this was just endorsed and approved by the FDA today. Nobody knew about it.
Right.
Your grandmother's going to recover. Or I think back to this movie from the 80s. It's one of the Star Trek movies. Oh, I can't remember which one it is, but it's where the Captain Kirk crew goes back in time and they go to like the 1980s, like 1984 or 85 or 86. And Dr. McCoy, there's a long chain of events that leads Dr. McCoy into a 1980s hospital. And he's just completely disgusted by these, barbaric ways of approaching medicine. And there's a lady laying on a gurney in the hallway as he's passing by. He's like wearing a lab coat because they're in disguise trying to rescue, I'm going into way too much detail, but they're trying to rescue Chekhov, who had gotten like a concussion or something like that, or something worse, some kind of head trauma. And he had been apprehended by the authorities and taken to the hospital. And the current day medicine had no way of turning him around. But anyway, the funny part is there's this lady laying on a gurney, and he walks by her, and she's an old lady, and he says, "What are you in for?" And she says, kidney failure. And I can't remember what they said they were going to do to try to help her, or if they said there's nothing they can do to help her. And he reaches into his little bag from his, whatever century Captain Kirk's crew is from. I'll let the Trekkies correct this, but he gives her a pill and he says, take this. Or take this and call me in the morning. I don't know if he uses that line, but he says, take this pill. He walks off. They go and find Chekhov. He uses, his modern medicine to basically like scan his head, and it fixes him. And then they're making a break for it. They're stealing, or they're breaking Chekhov out of this custody or whatever, and they're making a run for it. And they fly by the old lady. This is maybe like 5-10 minutes later. And she's just like yelling out loud. She said, the doctor gave me a pill and I grew a new kidney. So it's like, if reason interrupts the process and says, wait, there's a way where I don't want you to kill this loved one, this person, this enemy anymore, then, this is something that I wrestle with too, right? I'm not trying to dump on anything that we're talking about, but I also want to offer this pushback. And this, the last thing here is, oh man, I'm losing my train of thought. But the last thing is, I get stuck in, I don't see a difference between what the rationalist axiom is and even the person who says there's a person behind this, right? I guess the only difference that I would see is if my axiom is reason or rationality, if rationality does indeed rule me, then the person at the top of that is me, because I wield rationality. I run rationality through my filter, versus the axiom, the Abrahamic axiom in that story is a person outside of him. And I think a very good question that should be posed is, which person should be trusted in my axiomatic frame? And I think it's a very valid question, that Nathan offers, is why should I trust a person? Well, my question that I ask back to myself, why should I trust myself? Why should I trust?
Yeah.
Why? And that's what I'm seeking, is what's the good reason to put my faith in a particular person, whether it be me or this much lauded, much storied, ancient person that exists, that is said to exist through eternity. And it's a very difficult question for people to face, to say,
yep,
does that person even exist? At least I think I know I exist, And these are in, frames that people have, philosophers have touched on, the Descartesian, I think, therefore I am. I can't remember how you say it in Latin, but
yeah,
I'm experiencing my consciousness. I'm experiencing my person. Is there a greater person that exists out there that knows better than me, that I can actually get in touch with and trust? And I think that people who have the religious impetus, or have the faith, or the experience, or whatever you call it, the intuition, maybe the mother who says there's something, doctor's wrong.
yeah,
I can't even point to it anymore. I can just intuit it.
right.
There's a person out there that knows all this and can resolve all this, and I just intuit it. Some people have that intuition and some people don't. And I'm not upset with the people who don't have that intuition. And that's where I'll leave it.
That's good, Jeff.
Right.
That's really good.
So, Jeff, oh man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to distill this and say it, but in what you were talking about, I think what's really valuable there, and where I'd maybe push back on the axiom of rationality and the air quote whatever axiom of God being there as a person, functioning as a person, what I would argue is that, I don't know, anyone who's living well or in a healthy way cannot help but act as if, whatever you want to call it, but I would argue God is at the top of the hierarchy. You can't help it. And I think kind of a rationalist would, or let's just say a scientist for simplicity's sake, like, and I mean that in terms of like scientism, not, just a scientist.
Right.
They would say that, like, well, science, we may not have the answers, but we will. And science just hasn't shown us what the answers are, but it will. And we'll get there. We don't quite understand that yet, but it will. What that essentially is some kind of dynamic thing. It's somewhat impersonal, but it's this dynamic, I would argue, principality.
Faith.
That's at the top. Faith. That's at the top of their hierarchy. That's saying it gives us answers, and it hasn't quite given us answers, but it's this ineffable, transcendent thing, dynamic being that I am putting my hope in. But I agree with you, which is essentially God. I mean, you could call it God, or you can call it science. I mean, but in practical terms, in really simple terms, it's functioning as what I would call is like an orthodox understanding of God. It's this ineffable, transcendent thing that you submit to, and your understanding plays in that objectively and subjectively. But the part of like relating it to Isaac that I want to touch on is that you were saying that the rationalist scientific person could say, oh, more data has come in and that has stayed my hand. The difference is, and the hard part with that is that somehow that would have to, that God, the God of rationality, the God of information, the God of science, would somehow have to operate within your being and within your subjectivity in such a way that it could bridge the subjective objective gap in an instant to stay your hand. Which I would say,
I want to pause you for just. I'm sorry, Luke. I want to interrupt you and just ask. Can you explain that part a little bit more? Maybe bring more of an example, because I'm not sure I was able to connect that.
Can I try to explain it?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
So like, let's say you're about to take your mother off life support, and then the surgeon comes rushing in and is like, wait, don't do this yet. We have a possibility. Give us 2 hours to figure this out because I think we found something. Okay, that's not a trust in the rational. You're still not there yet. You basically, an authority has come down, and personally, it's whether you trust the surgeon or not. So it's you're still in the position of faith. You're just having faith in this person who you believe is going to be correct. So you haven't rationally gone through the whole thing and seen all the science and whatever. See, that's the thing with science that kind of gets a little bit fudgy, because the rational and the science is a network of trust that's distributed throughout the population and through organizations and systems that we have set up. It's not something an individual has. So like all the atheists, they didn't figure out evolution on their own. They didn't figure out Einstein's theory of relativity. They didn't figure out any of this science. It's a network of trust, and there's there's systems put in place, and it's like, well, if you don't believe in Newtonian science, go drop a bowling ball off the roof and measure the speed, and like you can do the calculations yourself, and like you can do all the science yourself if you have the equipment or whatever. But at some point you're just going to have to trust, because you can't rationally go through all of the experiments and all the stuff that you need to do to live a normal life. So you're still, and it's the same with God, because you can have this personally for me was a problem that I had, because I was raised in sort of a Christian environment where like you should pray, and if God tells you something, you should do it. And the question was always like, how do I know if it's God? And you're like, well, you can ask other people to make sure that you're not hearing something crazy, like sell everything you have and go, live as a homeless person in Cancun, Mexico, or whatever. You're like, I go to my pastor and I'm like, I think God's telling me to become homeless in Cancun. He's like, well, let's put a pause on that for this moment, and let's talk about it for a while before you pull the trigger on that. So it's this, it's the same. You kind of have this network of trust, and so this becomes like the institution of the church and traditions and laws and stuff. But they'll still be the point I'm getting at is like this system of rational science and stuff. It's not, I'm almost like agreeing with you, Jeff. It's not too much different from what Religions Project is trying to, that their sort of network of trust and whatever. And there's all sorts of corruption in there, and there's ways to weed it out, because the scientific system is just as culpable of corruption as any other system. And people can be trying to, like a drug company, they're like, we're going to just do a bunch of studies, and then when we get the right study that produces the results we like, then we publish that one. And that's a problem or whatever, or it's but I think that Luke, what was the thing that you were talking about that got us going on this?
The subjective part that it couldn't account for in the rationality model. Yeah, and Luke, I interrupted there just because I had that question, but I think people listening to this, and I want to try to be helpful for people to hear you clearly as well, when we can give examples of what you're talking about too.
Oh, well, so I think it's really hard to give an example, but what I was trying to, I think the Isaac example. Sorry. Oh, shut up, Cheddar. I'm at a gas station and the stupid thing is talking to me. Mute. I don't want to hear
on the road with Luke Thompson.
I'm just like, listen, I don't need your screen while I'm filling up with gas, losers. My bad. So what I was trying to get at is like, whatever your functional God is. So this is back to my whole science acting as your functional God. That's pretty much like an Orthodox God. You just call it science, because it's this ineffable thing that even though we don't fully understand it, someday we will. I mean, well, what does that sound like?
Yeah. It's the same argument that I'm making about trusting God, that he'll justify everything.
Exactly. It's the same thing. And so in order to act as if in the world, you have to put your faith in something that's ultimately transcendent and ineffable, but yet manifest in the immanent. So this is what I'm trying to get at, is this subjectively objective thing that I talk about, and that Paul says, "Oh, that's what I expect you to say, Mr. Woo Man, aspirin." Shout out Paul. Shout out Carl. So like when God tells Abraham to stay his hand, however he did it, whatever, breaks through in an anomalous event, and it's an obvious written in the clouds, or it's a manifested angel. Shut up, saying you're distracting us. But you know,
Luke fights with an inanimate object.
What? Yeah, no, it's kind of animated, but now it's done because I stopped pumping gas.
This is a microcosm, or I'm not using the right word, but the
symbolism happens.
This is right. This is what I always I talk about on the Discord. It's always the demons trying to stop us.
It's a symbolic. It's a symbol of Luke's battle with technology and AI.
It's the technological Babel trying to stop you from coming to enlightenment and connection with God.
It's technology. It's technology making my speech ununderstandable. That's what it's happening. So in order for Abraham, right, to stay his hand, something has to break into the subjective. What I'm trying to say is, like, this ineffable thing, this ineffable transcendent thing, call it science, call it God, call it the super thing, call it the universe, call it whatever, that transcendent, ineffable thing that you cannot fully understand, that you subject your trust to ultimately, because you have to, has to operate both. It has to operate in the subjective. And it reminds me, which I wish we had it recorded, whatever, the first time you said it, Jess, when you were talking about the Abraham story and breaking into the subjective, you said it perfectly, and I was super fired up. And that's what I'm trying to point at right here, is that God has to be able to act in your subjective. This ineffable thing has to be able to manifest in the subjective in order to stay your hand. Because if it's science, if it's facts, if it's information, if it's some empirical study to come in, that can't, if it's something from outside, that can't come in and then manifest in your subjective in order for you to stay your hand. It's not quick enough.
Yeah. It has to
be. Does that make sense?
Yeah. An interruption is not
the interrupting
rational.
God. The interrupting God. That's what this is titled. I called it, Jeff.
The God who interrupts.
That's fine. And I had mentioned something before we were recording, because Peterson talks about the anomalous being kind of left out of scientific method. And I can't remember exactly what he said, but I'm trying to think of like an actual example of this, and maybe you guys can help me, because I have one in mind, but it seemed like the similar thing to me when I brought it up earlier, is if there's an anomaly to what you're trying to account for in your test, it depends on how your test is set up and how you're bounding it. And when you bound it, you are leaving certain things out that are still a part of reality, but they're not germane to what you're trying to accomplish with your test. And sometimes the answer to what you're looking for is in that anomaly, right? But I'm failing on giving examples of that right now, so I don't feel like I'm explaining this very well.
Yeah, I mean, it's some kind of this is going off into a different thing, but there's some kind of superposition in between the rational and the I don't know what the other side would be. It's like this unknown. It's the whole thing with. Sorry, I don't have a thought right now.
So you talk about superposition. This reminds me of Andreas is wont to talk about this kind of stuff. I've heard Andreas talk about the superposition, and he could maybe flesh that out more in the comments or on Discord or something. But it's like, I don't know if you guys know this in chemistry. So my background is chemistry, and there's I don't know how much research has been done on this now, but there used to be more research on water as a water's like one of the best solvents in the world. Obviously, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And a solvent just means like what can dissolve some other solid substance. And then you have an aqueous solution, ridiculous. Aqueous solution of whatever is dissolved in the water. You know, so like Kool-Aid, that's a solvent. Or that's an aqueous solution with water as a solvent of the sugar and shit that's in Kool-Aid.
The delicious shit that's in Kool-Aid.
That's right, delicious, real good for you. But water, there's something called I think it's called a super state, where if you apply the right pressure and temperature and volume of water, and you have this, and you apply all of the exact right numbers of all those things, well, you can get it to this super state where water acts simultaneously as a solid, a liquid, and a gas. Yeah. It acts like all three at once. And there's that, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. And this is why all these things come together at the top. Like science shows you this, God shows you this. Like, and I guess what I'm saying is like, there's a way of being that is simultaneously subjective and objective, where, and God is that, God, the interrupting God is he who works from outside and from within. And this is why I think panentheism is such an important thing, is that the God that I'm talking about, the God who stayed Abraham's hand, he can't come exclusively from without. I guess that's the point that I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, well, there's something about the whole thing, which, so the, like Schrodinger's cat, the problem with Schrodinger's cat is like a problem of measurement. Like you don't know if sorry to bring up cats.
It's okay.
Schrodinger's cat is the problem of measurement. You don't know if the cat's alive or dead until you measure it. And so it's the inherent problem in measurement, especially in quantum stuff, because you don't know whether the particle is here or there until you measure it. And then when you do, you think you have it nailed down, but actually it was in some sort of superposition until the measurement took place, and then you established it. And it, the story of Abraham and Isaac, I don't have a way of like, it seems like it's that the faith that Abraham had was some sort of superposition. And whenever we try to describe it, we do it a disservice. Like and I'm saying, like, when Nathan tries to say it from his perspective and saying like, this was not good, why would you listen? This sounds crazy. Because that's true. It wasn't good, and it did sound crazy. And that's the whole point. And then the other side of it is like, maybe I'll say like, no, it was this, Abraham had faith and he trusted God. That description falls like on the other side, and it doesn't fully take into account the craziness and the not good that the situation, it was like a superposition state. And I think that's why the story is so powerful. Like these powerful stories have sort of this superposition state, but when you try to describe them, especially when you try to make them into, we're right back in your world, Luke, when you try to make the propositions out of them, then you've taken your measurement, but that's not what the thing was. The thing was it's in a superposition. And when you measure it, when you make it a propositional out of it, then all of a sudden you've actually, in the measurement, you've made an error.
Yeah. And to bring in Vervaeke and Mary and Paul, and then my narrative versus story thing, which I still think is a very important point. That was, Mary didn't give me a shout out. How dare you, Mary? But that was me who made that comment below your video. And maybe none of them thought it was a good point, but I'm about to tell you why it was. So to bring something down from the superposition is to make a narrative out of a story. It's to take a story which is ineffable and transcendent and irreducible, it's the territory, and make it a map. Yeah. Which is fine if you have something that you want to accomplish, but the story is better. I would also say this is why Paul's channel is what it is, and why community and relationships and dialogos will always transcend law or rules or models because it's dynamic and it's personal and it's real and it's full. It's total. You can't reduce it to a simple understanding, because whenever you do that, you kill the thing, and then you open up the opportunity for the totalizing impulse, which makes things dead. I mean, it's a fossil instead of a living thing.
Well, people are capable of being in a superposition. So the only way to understand the story is to participate with it in being. And so, like, how do you do that? Well, I don't know. Because I'm a modern secular Christian. Like I'm feeling this out. I like to describe things and make it into the propositional or whatever, but I think that's, and that's part of why
what I would say though,
had a problem.
Sorry.
That's part of the problem with the discussion between Julian and Nathan, because and what Julian was struggling to do was, just playing the propositional game and trying to describe things, like it has that inherent problem in it.
Yes, and that's what that spirit that you just talked about is what I'm talking about when I try to describe the egoic intellect.
Yeah.
When you keep everything in the realm of the propositional and in your mind and in your models, you fundamentally kill the superposition.
Yep.
You make the thing dead. It no longer is living. But this is why the power, and this is what I try to say, like when he talks to randos, when he asks people their story, I've been saying this recently. What's so great about someone's story is it has everything. It has all the truth in it.
Yep.
This is why I say fiction is better than nonfiction, is because all the truth that you can get in nonfiction is in the best fiction, but better, but full, but complete. It's not reduced to a simple thing. And this is why I get so frustrated with, this is what the egoic intellect does to you, is it makes you think that you're smarter when you read nonfiction. That's what it does.
Yeah.
And the truth is you're not. It's less true.
I am looking at the clock, and I need to wind down here, but I wanted to give us all a chance to say a final parting thing. That I'll go first because I want to hear from you guys last. First of all, in my parting, I'll give myself 60 seconds. It's Star Trek 4 that I referenced earlier. Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, which is a part of a three movie story arc, which I highly recommend if you haven't watched it, about the death and resurrection of Spock.
I love that this is part of your closing.
That's my closing. I guess the other part of my closing would be this, and that is back to the drowning babies and the strangling babies. The stories in the Bible have a very personal tinge to them. Like there is a person that these acts are being attributed to. And I can see how that's very hard for someone to just say, well, yeah, I know, but so I get that. But I'm still left in the place with reality. Let's step away from scripture. And I go to those realities of these things that just happen to babies, but also happen to us, the wearing down of entropy. We are all killed by reality. We all will be killed. We will all be worn down to dust by reality. And I have my dad's ashes here.
Yep.
And so I guess the place where I continue to land is, if there is no person that can answer for this, and it's just, I don't want to use just, let's say that the reality is, I'm probably going over 60 seconds here. The reality is there's nothing behind it. It just is, and just deal with it. That's unacceptable to me. I told this to Paul in my first conversation with him. I don't want to live anymore if that's how it is. Like at least a person who can answer for this, that is more moral than me somewhere. Like if all of these things are horrible that are recorded in the Bible, which and they're attributed to this masochistic evil being.
Yeah.
Well, my hope is that there's a being that's better than that somewhere that can answer for even allowing that kind of stuff to happen in the first place. So that's where I'll leave my piece.
Well, if I may go next, Jess, because there's something in that I want to respond to, and it could maybe be a teaser for a future episode of something, is what I would respond to that with, Jeff, is that I think embedded and implicit within what you were almost saying is that, or I would push back this way, is I would say that being itself is reflective of the very thing that you hope for. I think in the whole way that we've been talking about how a person has to be at the top of this and why it's true, if we are persons and if we are being, it's reflective of that reality. And I think it necessarily and logically has to be. And a lot of times, and I mean, we don't have to go into that argument now and all that, of how I would explain that, but I think that's why I talk about a lot, that if you are being, if you are alive, you are reflecting in the kind of belief and knowledge, the Eucharistic knowledge, to tease another term, that you believe in the God that I would propose as real. And it's interesting that you said, like, if that's not true, I don't want to be anymore. I think that's also reflective of a belief in it, because, and this is the crazy thing about, I think, the God that I profess to love, is that I think he's inescapable. And even if you manifest a distaste and a belief that you don't even love being anymore, I think he's redeemed even that. So I guess, I don't know, with all of my wooey nonsense that maybe made no sense to anyone, I would close with that. Aspirin.
All right, I'm gonna close with that quote I tried to say, but I botched.
Yeah, just the fresh gets the last word.
This is all right. Nathan Muir, that's Robert Redford's character in Spy Game. He says, when I was a kid, I used to spend summers on my uncle's farm, and he had this plow horse he used to work with every day. He really loved that plow horse. One summer, she came up lame. It could barely stand. The vet offered to put her down. Do you know what my uncle said? He said, "Why would I ask someone else to kill a horse that belonged to me?" And that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's good.
All right, thanks, guys. It was a good one. And do
you want to change the title to "Why did we kill? Why would I let you kill my horse?"
Why would I ask someone to kill a horse that belonged to me? Jeff,
the interrupting God, or why would I ask someone else to kill my horse?
Maybe that's what I'll do, the whole thing. Yeah, that'll be the title.
I love the alternate title option.
We only had one a while back, so we might be ripe for another one.
You should just type out the whole tag, like the transcript of it, and that'll just be on that'd be good. I'm just
all right. Somebody send me a description, because I'm not going to remember what we talked about.
All right, I'll send you a description when I send you the link.
All right. Talk to you guys later.
All right, bye.
Bye.